Welcome, dear ladies and gentlemen. I hope you've had a good lunch break and maybe even an opportunity to do some networking with other participants. My name is Vincent Manuel Herr. I'm a freelance author and speaker, and I will be moderating this afternoon's Track 2 sessions. This is also your reminder. If you're hearing me right now, you are logged in with Track 2 for this afternoon. So if you'd like to join our colleagues in Track 1 instead, you can switch now just by clicking the button right underneath the live stream. Track 2 today will focus on a governance framework for agricultural data, or in German, Regeln und Leitlinien für Agrardaten in der EU. There will be 2 sessions this afternoon. This one, the first, will focus on current challenges. The second session later this afternoon at 4 p.m. will take participants on a deep dive of those issues and questions. During both of those sessions today, audience members, so you, will be able to ask and pose questions directly to our speakers and experts. To do so, please enter your question in the chat box to the right of the live stream. And please consider including your own name, the institution you represent, and to whom your question is addressed. We will try to address as many of your questions as possible during 2 Q&A sessions, one halfway through each session and one at the end of each session. Feel free already to enter your questions while the experts speak and don't just wait for the Q&A itself. So we already have questions lined up and can get started immediately when the Q&A commences. Now, with all the housekeeping being done, let's get to the content. Our speakers for this first session of Track 2 are Dr. Klaus Haider from the German Federal Ministry of Food and Agriculture, Dr. Doris Marquardt from the European Commission. Doris Marquardt is filling 2 roles today. She will be a speaker and an expert giving a presentation. She will also moderate the 2 Q&A sessions of session 1. Further speakers are Daniel Azevedo from Copa Cogeca, Dr. Simone van der Berg from Wageningen University in the Netherlands, and Professor Leanne Weisman from Griffith University in Australia. Welcome to all of you. We're looking forward to hearing your inputs. Each speaker will present for the time previously agreed upon. For the sake of timekeeping with our schedule, I have been asked to keep a good eye on the time and to make sure that we stay on track. So we will inform each speaker via chat roughly 2 minutes before their time is up, so that they know. And I might also audibly just ask you to come to a close once time is up. I apologize this ahead of time. I do not mean to cut anything short, but it is, I think, important that we have a lot of time for the discussion and the questions by audience members. With all of that being said, let's come to our first speaker. We'll start with Dr. Klaus Haider. He's Director General for Rural Development and Digital Innovation at the German Federal Ministry of Food and Agriculture. His talk is entitled A Governance Framework for Agricultural Data. Good afternoon, Klaus Haider. The digital floor is yours. Dr. Haider, you're still muted. You need to unmute you exactly. Yes, now it should work.
Thank you, and good afternoon to participants and ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted that so many participants have registered for our conference these days. In times like these, that shows us 2 things. Firstly, the topic of our conference is an important one. Secondly, digitalization has already become an integral part of our lives. Without it, our digital meeting today would not even be possible. Way before the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, our lives, our communities, and our communication gained a new digital dimension. Our conference today makes this quite clear. We will discuss how agriculture can settle in the digital world and how we interact with one another in this digital sphere. We will address the question of which rules apply within our sector to the digital world. IT businesses from the US, Europe, China as well, see to customers all across the world often with considerable flexibility and great adaptability regarding the different political and legal systems in place. Yet we, from the national government perspective, wonder ever more frequently how our national legislation and its limited impact on the digital transformation may be brought in line with the global networks. This brings us straightforward to the EU perspective and towards this track of our conference. Time and again, it has become evident that the digital transformation significantly shapes the agriculture sector in Europe. And digitalization is the key leading edge technology we need to resolve target conflicts, such as ensuring global food security while preserving natural resources. What is more, the agri-food sector, among others, plays a pioneering role with respect to the digital transformation. Take, for example, AI technologies in data farm management, sensor technologies, as well as satellite and geodata-aided technical solutions and unmanned flight systems. The biggest gains from digitalization in agriculture are expected to come from enhancing productivity, from reductions in working hours and workload, and from a governmental perspective, especially important, potentially making production more sustainable. Digitalization leading to reductions in the use of fertilizers, plant protection products, and energy, as well as improvements in animal welfare. But despite all these opportunities, there is also need for action. After all, collecting, sharing, and accessing of data is not only linked to knowledge about the challenges and requirements farmers face on a daily basis. Smart data networking may also help make predictions on the harvest and on the output volume. So it goes without saying that whoever is in possession of agriculture data can influence the agriculture markets. Industry and trade have been showing their interest in data provided by farmers for some time because their data is a valuable economic good. Data, in a way, are a new type of resource. This raises questions regarding data sovereignty and data security, resource security. We need fair rules providing more legal certainty and a fair balance of interests. Farmers must be able to meet providers on an equal footing. We have a new study on this issue conducted by the Fraunhofer Institute for Experimental Software Engineering in Kaiserslautern and their project partners up in our commission. Out of the results, allow me to mention 5 key needs that form the basis and starting point for further action. I think most of you would agree. Firstly, farmers want less red tape. I think nobody will be surprised. Secondly, farmers want to have continued sovereignty over their own data. Thirdly, farmers want better and easier access to information by the government. Fourthly, farmers and agricultural holdings need open, machine-readable interfaces for data exchange. And fifthly, authorities, in turn, want stronger networking among state authorities. Starting from here, we will decide at short notice as to how we can best attend to these needs. Because it is becoming apparent that agriculture data is an enormous resource which we will have to tap carefully, managing its use in the best way possible. Professor Hertel's report, which we commissioned some time ago and which was mentioned already by my minister in her introduction speech this morning, shall help us in this implementation. The report on the topic of European guidance and rules for agricultural data was prompted by the fact that there are only partial laws and regulations in the EU for the right to non-personal agriculture data, non-personal. In this respect, digital service providers and farmers very frequently agree on standardized and complex terms of contract. In 2018 already, European associations drew up an EU Code of Conduct on agriculture data sharing. This, however, considered that this Code of Conduct needs to be revised in order to fully ensure farmers' data sovereignty and to move with the times. So we all, Commission, Member States, stakeholder bodies, today and tomorrow take stock of the experience of this EU Code of Conduct. Or as Professor Martinez pointed out this morning, that we have to review if the existing system is sufficient. While doing this, Professor Hertel's report might help us as well, and giving some color into our discussion today and tomorrow by proposing specific measures to discuss and to ensure an appropriate management of agriculture data for the future. Let me highlight 6 central fields and proposals from this report. Firstly, the goal will be to adopt an EU Agriculture Data Legal Act, or as an alternative to further develop cross-sectoral horizontal data law and to create specific provisions for agriculture therein. Secondly, farmers' data sovereignty is proposed to stand at the center as the key element of this EU legal act. The peculiarity is here, instead of regulating the right of ownership of data, the data sovereignty must be regulated. Data sovereignty grants the owner the right to access the agriculture data collected and to control the access of third parties. So digital data sovereignty implies a certain level of self-determination of farmers regarding their own agriculture data and how it is used. Thirdly, in addition, it is proposed to introduce a new data category called operating data. This would eliminate legal gray areas in demarcation problems. This currently often difficult to attribute agriculture data to the existing data categories, personal or non-personal data, and open data. Fourthly, the EU legal act could also include provisions on general terms and conditions in the business-to-business sector. This way, standard contracts or GT&C templates could be included in the annex of the act. Additionally, there should also be a discussion on whether and under what conditions data access rights should be regulated in a binding manner. Fifthly, good agriculture data platforms could be a way of ensuring the self-determination of farmers over their data. In this respect, by drawing of an EU legal act, the experience made with the Gaia X should be taken into account. One additional proposal is that agriculture data cooperatives may be considered as a new form of data platform. Farmers could use them to network regionally and nationally and cooperate in terms of data management. Sixthly, an EU agriculture data certification system would specify the compliance with certain minimum standards for data. An EU legal act on data should regulate prerequisites for certification, the certification procedure, and the accreditation of certification bodies. A uniform EU agriculture data seal of approval, which may only be used by certified companies, should also be enshrined in a legal act. So I think these are 6 very exciting proposals for further discussion. We should seize the opportunity today and tomorrow to discuss these fields. Finally, let me add an exciting further field of development. We are also very much committed in Germany with our federal government right now to developing the agriculture domain as part of the European Gaia X project. Gaia X is to be the bedrock for the next generation of artificial intelligence in the agri-food sector. Together, we want to build an efficient and competitive data infrastructure to establish a digital ecosystem providing security based on European values, a system that contributes to value addition and job security in Europe. At the same time, we want to build up confidence in our own networks. We are working intensively to achieve this goal together with France and other European partners. Which brings me to my final remarks. We want to work carefully when it comes to the regulation of agriculture data by still promoting inventions and innovation. And we want to find an European solution in order to further strengthen our European community. On behalf of the German Council Presidency, I'm convinced that this conference will give us a starting point and the opportunity to do this. Thank you very much.
Dr. Haider. It's yours.
Thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you also for the invitation to make a contribution to this conference. In the following, I would like to provide an overview on the European strategy for data, and particularly pay attention to the implications for the agriculture sector and agriculture policies. Let's have a big overview on what is going on. So the digital age is one headline ambition from the European Commission comparable to the headline ambition of the Green Deal. So it was backed up by the digital package, which was published and adopted in February 2020. The digital package had many components. Most importantly, the communication on shaping Europe's digital future, also a white paper on AI, and a communication on the European strategy for data. In the following shortly, this data strategy. So before going into detail what's about the data strategy, let's look at the years. But it's also about the volume of the data economy, which is expected to triple, and data professionals. A slight increase is predicted for the percentage of population with digital skills. So there we may still face challenges. So while we are performing good in the European Union with several issues already concerned to data, for instance, the GDPR is known to everyone and also duplicated and replicated in other areas of the world, we still have to analyze the problems if we want to use the potential of data effectively and efficiently. So what problems are we currently facing? So there's not data enough available for the reuse, and that also concerns public data. We sometimes have challenges with the user empowerment. So are we always able to port our data to other references? We lack in Europe storage solutions. So we know that frequently our personal data is stored. It's not always on servers in the European Union. And there's a lack of governance. We just had it in the previous presentation, outlined and pointed out also for the agriculture sector. Overall, one problem is the fragmentation of the single market, meaning if there would not be action at European level, the single market may not be present and fragmented because member states take initiatives and they want to solve and address the problems. But if everybody acts in parallel, we have a fragmentation, or there might be the fragmentation of the single market. Against this background, we have to have a vision how to handle data in the European Union. And that exactly is addressed in the data strategy. So it's about becoming an attractive, secure, and dynamic data economy. So it's about setting clear and fair rules and access for the reuse of data. And there the data strategy has quite a comprehensive approach. It's about considering the economy and the society. It's about cross-sectoral approaches. And it's the consumer as well as the service provider is addressed. So it's about investing in next generation standards, tools, about pooling European data in key sectors, and with a European-wide approach and interoperable solutions. And always also considered the user perspective. So it's important to give the users the rights, tools, and skills to stay full control of the data. That all should lead to creating an internal market for data. In the data strategy, what is outlined is about legislative, investment, and strategic initiative. To provide a simplified overview about what is the data strategy about, we can distribute it into 4 segments. The first is about a cross-sectoral governance framework for data access and use. Then we have so-called enablers. That might be investments in data infrastructure and digital infrastructure. Competences is a key issue at personal level, for instance, digital skills in schools, but also advanced digital skills and capacities of SMEs is a focal point. And of special attention for the presentation today is the rollout of common European data spaces. So now we would like to go into more detail for the different sections. The common European data spaces. This is not a data platform on this figure. It's a concept. And in the data strategy, several data spaces are proposed. Data spaces may cover only public data, or they might be a private initiative, or both of them, a mixture, public-private. So what is important, it's driven by stakeholders. And the input may come from personal data spaces, but also from the public sphere. And what is the ambition behind in the data strategy is that there is a kind of horizontal framework for those data spaces. So it's not only about common public data sets, which are fed into the data spaces, but also about data intermediaries, respect certain data sovereignty rules. And despite all the data spaces may follow an own logic to some extent, there's a common governance standards and a cross-sectoral interoperability approach. So making the data spaces more effective. Naming only one example, datasets, public datasets, which are important or relevant for the Green Deal data space, may also be important for the agriculture data space, soil, climatic data, for instance. What is also in the data strategy are a clear outline for legal proposals or legal initiatives. So the first one you may have taken note of was released as a proposal by the European Commission at end of November. It's about an enabling framework for the governance of the common data spaces. It has been released as a Governance Act. Then there will be a Market Power Instrument and a Digital Service Act coming as a package. Still this year, you see it's a tough agenda as it regards timeline. Then an Implementing Act and the Open Data Directive, focusing on so-called high-value data acts. We will come to that in this presentation later. And then in 2021, also a Data Act, which is then more explicitly focusing on IoT-generated, co-generated data and business-to-government data sharing. So it's more easy to capture the data strategy in the following if you explicitly look at the agriculture sector. Otherwise, the field would be too broad. What are the implications? So only to recap, and I think the scene setter this morning, the first session, was quite explicit in that regard. If we look from different perspectives on agriculture data, we can note and recap that private and public data are essential for input for smart farming. So at the same time, digital technologies generate large amounts of data. And they are not only important for the sector and the agriculture production and the farmer itself, but also for policy monitoring, research and innovation, and product development, for instance, seed development. And if you then go one step further and have product development or plant technology development and so on, European-wide data sets have a special value because we have the comparison between different climatic zones. We have more reference data become up to big data. So the main point to be take note of is agriculture data has a value and is potentially also marketable. This topic was already discussed this morning in depth and also touched up in the previous presentation. So against backgrounds that agriculture data has a value and that both is relevant, private and public ones, there's a need to encourage data sharing and the pooling of private and public data to allow, for instance, for data technology applications. In the next presentation, I'm confident we will learn more about the code of conduct on agriculture data sharing already mentioned. So that is already in place for facilitating data sharing. But at the same time, technical solutions may become quite relevant and actually needed to facilitate data sharing in addition, and to replace the trust in data sharing by technical solutions. And what's important to take note of, various types of data platforms for sharing agriculture data do already exist. So that is the situation. And if we now come to the proposal of a common European agriculture data space, it's proposed in the data strategy. In the annex, you find the details. It's one data space in a set of data spaces. And the main proposed outlined in the data strategy is the facilitation of trustworthy sharing and pooling of data for the sector. At the same time, it has also the potential to provide a basis for research and innovation and for policy proposals, for instance, and for the economy, for instance, for product development, as just mentioned. It's announced that it has to build up on the experience with the code of conduct on agriculture data sharing. So it's not starting from scratch, it should consider that and reflect on that, how it can be embedded. It's here to be paid attention. It's on the one hand, an action and a measure in the Digital Euro program. So the establishment is supported financially under the Digital Euro program. At the same time, it's accompanied by a set of forthcoming legal acts I pointed to. Key point to take note of that this design is still to be defined. So there are many open questions we will shed light on. So if I now with the questions to the audience, how may a common European agriculture data space look like? And you would have the opportunity to scribble and draw in Slido, then I would be confident that we would have a range and a landscape of different pictures, different ideas, And yes, that is the case because there is no defined concept at the moment yet. And it's good that there are various ideas going on and to be discussed. So only for highlighting a possible organizational approach and the question which options we could discuss for agriculture data space. If you look at the left side, there would be the option that only private data is pooled in a data space, or that there's the pooling of private and public data, but it's only used for private sector purposes. And the third option would be that agriculture data from the private and the public sphere is pooled, but it's also used and made available for instance, public and common good purposes. And you can go through and consider and reflect on what are the advantages and disadvantages. I don't want to make a judgment. I only highlight the different options. But with all that, not enough. So there are many more open questions. What is the content? Which actors are involved? How do we finance the data space? And about technical aspects. What is about data interoperabilities? Do we have standards? So having highlighted the problem or the challenge we are still facing with the data space, and which also is an opportunity, we have to look at the next steps towards the data space. So in the data strategy, it's announced that the space will be elaborated with stakeholders and member states. And this conference is one stepping stone, an important one on the way to the data space, because such discussions are essential. In June, we already had a first workshop on data sharing, followed by a second one, a big stakeholder workshop, also fostering on the common data space with 250 participants. We had position papers from stakeholders, from member states, from the scientific community. And this webinar revealed the complexity of the question around the common data space. So what is important to know? More participation and exchange are needed to formalize and elaborate and agree on a concept of the common data space. What is at the same time important is the stock taking of related initiatives which are already ongoing and should not be ignored but embedded into the concept. So for instance, in the field of platforms, GaiaX was already mentioned, and in the field of data interoperability. One important milestone will be the finalization of the first work program of the Digital Euro program, expected for the end of the year. And then the development of horizontal and cross-sectoral legal acts. And the Digital Euro program, what is announced for the Common Agriculture Data Space for the first program 21-2022 is that the data space will deploy the data sharing tools and platforms, the creation of data governance frameworks, and improve the availability, quality, and interoperability of data, both in the domain and across sectors. You see at the moment a quite general formulation, which still has to be filled with life and to be made more concrete. What is important that is the data space is to be developed by connecting different infrastructures deployed already. So that relates to the previous slide, to the stock taking I mentioned. If we look at the upcoming horizontal actions on data, I mentioned the legislation on data governance, which has been released or proposed by the Commission end of November. What is the scope of the Act? So it's a horizontal cross-sectoral approach, looking at private and public concerns. It's looking on cross-sectoral data interoperability and particularly aiming at stimulating the sharing of data and the reuse of certain public data. So it looks also on providers on data sharing services, so at trusted intermediaries. In the previous presentation, there was a proposal for having acknowledged or certified agriculture data intermediaries. Exactly that is reflected in the proposal, and you find it with a labeling approach, with a horizontal cross-sectoral approach. There's a section on data altruism, making more data available for instance, research and innovation proposals. We have here a conference looking on research and innovation. What is the role of that in digitalization? The proposal tries to find solutions to make more data available through data, let's say, donation. And for the interoperability cross sectors, there's a proposal for the creation of a so-called European Data Innovation Board, which should assist the Commission in finding cross-sectoral approaches and also to govern the data spaces. Another legal act forthcoming is the Data Act. So that is still under discussion, and it is expected, as announced in the data strategy, to foster on the questions around the access for public sector to private health data and on the flexibility to use big data. Another aspect is the questions around the ownership of co-generated IoT data and the copyright. What I would like to highlight is that there will be a public consultation, and it would be essential, considering the ambitions and the subject we are discussing today, that the stakeholders from the agriculture sector participate, contribute to the public consultation, because also horizontal legislation is likely to shape agriculture data sharing conditions. One legal act, an implementing act on so-called high-value data sets, is announced for early 2021. So what are high-value data sets? They are important benefits for economic and society. So that is an attribute of the so-called high-value data sets. They should be available free of charge in a machine-readable format and usable for APIs, and if relevant, available as bulk downloads. So meaning they have the potential as public data sets falling under the Open Data Directive to be fed directly and to be usable for the data spaces. If you look at the thematic scope, which are predefined in the Open Data Directive, geospatial data, Earth observation data, environmental data, also business data, that might be quite of interest to as ingredient or component of the agriculture data space. So the concrete data sets falling under the scope of the high-value data sets are currently defined. For the member states, the public administration, it's important to note that there will be financial support under the Digital Euro program fostering the preparation of high-value data sets. And let's look on the Digital Euro program. So this slide presents only one component of the Digital Euro program. It's a section. So the Digital Euro program itself is much broader. It also captures cybersecurity, for instance, or digital innovation hubs and digital skills. But for data and data sharing, data pooling, and capitalizing data, the section on AI and data and cloud is particularly relevant. So if we look at the left side, we have here the support to the different data spaces, including the agriculture data space. And then, in addition, I would like to call your attention to another element, the so-called testing and experimentation facilities for AI. And one of them is foreseen to be for agriculture and agri-food. If you look at this, it's about testing and experimentation facilities for AI and agri-food. What is that? So testing and experimentation facilities are planned for the first work program in the Digital Euro program in agri-food. They are to pave the way for the deployment of AI and to boost the uptake of AI-based solutions. It's about greater efficiency and uniformity of testing, experimenting, and also validation. For instance, we have AI-based solutions in the sector developed by the private sector, and now we would like to validate that their performance, for instance, in reducing emissions. Are they really performing? Is there independent testing possible, for instance? And it should be about large-scale, world-class technology infrastructure for the testing and experimentation. So for instance, for SMEs, providing really a trial field. So, and in the agri-food sector, it could be, for instance, a trial farm testing AI-based robotics, or a trial field. This morning we have heard about the 5G test beds. So something similar to that. It's a proposal under the Digital Euro program, and also that has to still be filled with life and shaped and a direction to be set. The testing and experimentation facilities should also face the exchange of experience and the visits of experts. So there should be an exchange and possible also to be used by other stakeholders. Ideally, there are links to the so-called digital innovation hubs, which have an innovation power oriented to the end users. And now it comes eventually to a common agriculture data space, depending on the final design of the common agriculture data space. So meaning if, for instance, the users of the common agriculture data space are ready to make available their data also to some extent or some of the data in an aggregated format, non-aggregated format, also for research and innovation, or they use it as a marketplace for AI and the economy, then, for instance, the testing and experimentation facilities could also be benefit from the common agriculture data space. And here we have to consider that the data strategy fosters also end-user empowerment, meaning the rights and the sovereignty of the farmers are of high priority. Overall, it's about capitalizing on the capitalization of data that applies to the testing and experimentation facilities, here as one concrete example, but it's also about the overall data strategy. So the implications for the agriculture sector is that the data strategy can help to further capitalize the agriculture data for the sector, but also for agriculture policies and the common good, depending on how it is used. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention and stop my screen.
All right. Dr. Marquardt, thank you very much for your presentation, for highlighting all those points for us. I think that's been quite interesting. A quick note before we continue, some of you may have experienced some sort of audio trouble earlier in the session. Our IT colleagues have been on that, and I do hope that the issue has been resolved. So I think things should go much smoother from now on. Our apologies for that happening. We'll now continue with our third input, our third speaker, that is Daniel Azevedo. He is director in the Commodities and Trade of Copa Cogeca, the two largest umbrella organizations of European agriculture. He will share his thoughts on how to ensure the farmer's data sovereignty. Good afternoon to you, Daniel. Thank you for being here, and the floor is yours. Daniel, can you hear me? All right. I don't think you're muted. Okay. See your screen. We cannot hear you right now. Okay. Can you maybe just mute and unmute yourself to just see if that works better? Okay. I'm sure we'll fix it in a second. I still cannot hear you. Can you? Yes, this sounds better. I can hear you now. Okay, perfect. Perfect. And you can see my. Yes, we can. Yes, you're all good to go. Thank you.
I apologize for this, and I would like to really coming from a family farm. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm pleased to be here to represent the interest of European farmers and agri cooperatives. So very quickly, I would like to introduce you to COPA and Cogeca, the two umbrella organizations. COPA representing 22 million farmers and their families across Europe. And Cogeca represents the interest of 22,000 European agricultural cooperatives across Europe. Cogeca, as a joint secretariat, has created in 62 and is one of the largest active organizations in Brussels. All our documents are available in 7 different languages. We like to ensure that the farmers in the different member states, they are able to interact with the decision makers in Brussels in their language. So we are very committed to EU common policies. We are very supportive of the digital single market, and in particular, we have shown our support to the European data spaces, and therefore we see the single market as an important tool, and we have a lot of experience. As you know, the Common Agriculture Policy is one of the founding policies, has delivered very well in these 60 years, ensuring a prosperous internal market, but also the food security. And in particular, during the periods of COVID-19, it has proven itself over and over again. So taking into account that we are now discussing a new EU framework, this will also deliver certain ambition that we will try to certainly to deliver. And coming next to climate change challenges, where there are no climate deniers in the farming community, we are very much aware of the effects on climate change, and therefore we are very committed to the implementation of the Paris Agreement. So for us, the digital is an opportunity. It's one of the tools that can help us not only to remain competitive, to continue providing high quality and affordable food across the world that is recognized by the sustainability, but will also help us to deliver in certain of the challenges that we have ahead, and like climate change. And therefore, we want to make sure that these technologies, they will deliver. So we are not coming from nothing. European farmers and cooperatives are already using new technologies that are generating the data. And here, of course, this will be more interesting for the discussion will come after, but we see the deployment of technologies providing and collecting data, or managing the data, or processing data in order to create data support systems to European farmers and their cooperatives as a very important tool, because it will not help only the farmer to manage the resources, or the cooperative with their cooperative, but will also deliver on all the aspects, like, for example, improving the functioning of the food chain, where European farmers right now have very little tools to provide additional information to the consumer, but we do want to engage with the consumer and provide additional information. And the digital technology, using, for example, blockchain, could be one of those opportunities. Also, a very important aspect has been already mentioned. This is not only about business, it's also how to improve the life conditions of the farmers and their families in rural areas. Most of the enabling infrastructure will actually support not only the farming community, but will also support the business in rural areas and the rural lives. And of course, an important aspect is the interaction with the administration, that could possibly help us to increase compliance with regulations, with the EU framework, but also provide European farmers with some of the tools to do their job better and better. So these technologies are clearly an opportunity, but they need to provide their clear benefits for the farmer. So the discussion regarding framework on the data governance, it's just a piece of a wide strategy that we need to have in place that need to integrate decision-making systems, transparency, infrastructure, the digital skills, investment, innovation, etc., etc. So from the European farm's point of view, trust and transparency was very important since the beginning. That's why we have decided to move forward towards a code of conduct of data sharing. And that became because the farmers saw the need to have a clear principles in order to address some of the topics that were discussed, some of the principles. So we very much would see almost eye to eye the proposals that were put forward by Klaus Heider, the previous speaker. Of course, the code of conduct needs now to evolve. It was an initial effort to bring in the efforts of the agri-food chain and try to develop a set of principles, and also to engage in the discussions that now are leading to the governance framework that we very much welcome, and we will tell you more ahead. So, yeah, 2 or 3 years ago, the discussion was within our own ranks was, why should I share my data? It's my data. If you want to have access, you should pay. And it was important to set up the right tone in order to have a conversation about what kind of data is available, what is the data that needs to be shared, what is the public data, what is the agronomic data, what is machine-generated data. And so this was, I think, the first victory, was actually to frame the debate. And now the objective is not why should I share, because we share data in order to create value, and the value to be distributed among the value chain, but also is how then we can share the data. And that was also one of the objectives of the code of conduct, is to promote data sharing in order to create a value. So most of our partners actually participated, from the Young Farmers Seed Association, from Machinery Association, so fertilizers, contractual that provide services to farmers. So it was very important to assemble this coalition in order to come together on a voluntary set of approach. And of course, in the understanding that actually agriculture is a very specific sector that has their own needs, that has their own organization, and we need to make sure that we take that in account. And now on the EU Code of Conduct on Agricultural Data Sharing, some of the principles that I think will be are being translated in the regulations that are coming forward, or the proposals that are coming forward. It is basically a voluntary approach driven by the agri-food sector, defines clear responsibilities. One of the clear principles is that the data that is produced on the farm and during the farm operations is attributed to the farmer, and it may be used extensively by him and her. And it comes because the farmer needs to have access not only the data that is produced on his farm, but also the data that is produced along the value chain, and that needs to be shared with the farmer so that he can also adapt according to the market needs. And he must have the role in controlling the access and the use of data for their business. These are two key principles. And the objective is not to share data by sharing the data. The objective is to share data in order to create value, but then to make sure that the farmer will reap the benefits of sharing that data. Because he plays a key role. Not only he applies the technology, he invests on technology that collects the data. He invests his time and his business in order to provide this data. And of course, one of the principles on the European data space that we are very much interested in contributing to and welcoming for the efforts made by the European Commission is actually to allow that the farmer will be able to move his data from a data platform to another according to his needs or according to his interest. So to ensure that the data is portable, that there is interoperability between the systems that allow for this to happen. But of course, talking with agriculture, there's plenty of sensitive information. There is information that the farmer provides with the national administration that is sensitive on his farm, but there is also data that is sensitive, for example, on the machines, the functioning of the machine. The farmer has no interest to know the functioning of the machine, but has interested on the agronomic data that is provided by the machines that work on his farm. And so the original objective of the code was to allow for contracts to follow key principles. Of course, now we will engage in the dialogue in the framework of the European governance framework for data. And of course, we will. I'm sure we will still discuss this within our members. We still have to dig into the specifics. But a first preliminary approach, it shows that most of our members, or the principles that we already agree and we put forward, they are inside these European data governments, and obviously we welcome it. and we'll certainly contribute to it. And of course, we are translating the code in different languages to ensure that everyone has access. Many of our members have already implemented their national codes of conduct, where they have also reached agreements with the other organizations. So we see that the principles of the code of conduct were taken. And though now we need, as already mentioned by one of the speakers, we need to make sure that there are technical solutions that will actually allow to move from trust to implementing the principles in a way that the farmer doesn't have to click OK for every data set. So for us, the key it will be always how we can create the benefits, and then how can make sure that the farming community benefits from data sharing. And I would like to thank you, the organization, for inviting us, and I would like to thank the European Commission for the tremendous effort on the proposals they put forward, and we will certainly engage with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Daniel Azevedo, for your remarks. I really appreciate that. We'll now straight go into our first brief Q&A. It's just going to be a few minutes. We'll have more time for Q&A at the end of the session. We've been getting a lot of questions for all speakers, but particularly for Doris Marquardt. I'll just try to find 3 questions we address for each of the speakers. Would like to ask all of you to keep your responses brief, so then we can continue with our program. For Doris Marquardt, I think, Doris, I will combine 2 questions for you into one. One participant asks, how will the EU agricultural data space improve data sovereignty for farmers? And maybe a related question, how can an EU legal act or framework incentivize the private sector to share agricultural data? Doris, your thoughts on this, maybe brief if possible.
So it's important to reflect that the common data space is shaped by the stakeholders, including farmers and the member states, and it's framed by the legislation. So I highlighted in my presentation and pointed to the Act on Data Governance and the forthcoming Act on Data called Data Act. So taking the Data Governance Act as one example, one concrete element which is proposed there is to label, for instance, data intermediaries, meaning it would be a third party who provides data sharing services, and he would or she would be certified for trustworthy data sharing. So the farmer, for instance, would not still directly share his or her data with machinery company or with somebody else along the agri-food supply chain, but he or she could save his data on the data platform, which is certified as a third party and labeled as trustworthy data sharer. And then could he or she decide with whom and to what extent the farmer would like to share the data. So that is one possibility, one scheme proposed in the Act on Data Governance, quite relevant for the farmer. And for us, it would now be important that this is also reflected in the further development of the common data space.
Doris, thank you so much. That was very precise. We really appreciate that. One question is for Klaus Haider. It says, how do you envision to limit market control of few global players in the control of agricultural data? Klaus Haider, a question for you.
Thank you for the question. I think it's not a question just for the agriculture sector, but for the whole area, and how we position ourselves now in this data-driven economy, business to consumer, but also business to business. And so we will have some responses, we need some responses on this question, surely on the European level. And this Data Act that is coming up next year will be very important process in this sense, also for our agriculture community, and this positioning between farmers and these big companies. So I'm looking forward that starting from processes that began already several years ago and have now this conference here today and tomorrow, we will have to position ourselves, EU member states and the Commission, to bring in our positions into this Data Act so that we will have an equal balance between farmers and these big companies' data rights concerning.
Great. Thank you very much for your prompt response to that. One more question, maybe before we continue with our inputs. This one's for you, Daniel. It reads, are there plans at Copa Cogeca to further develop the COC, or Code of Conduct, I presume?
Oh, so for the moment, the short-term plans are to continue translation and to ensure everyone has access. And now, on the framework of the Commission proposals, we'll certainly have to look into it and see what can be done. Let's just remind that the Code of Conduct is not just Copa Cogeca. We are there together with 11 other partners from animal health to machinery, SEMA, SEJA, Young Farmers, FEFAC for the feed. So this will be something that we'll certainly do, taking into account the new proposals on the table.
Great. Thank you, Daniel, for your response to this. We have some more questions that are here. I think we'll just keep collecting questions for a longer Q&A. I propose that we keep going now to somewhat stay with the schedule and still have the 20 minutes allotted for the Q&A right at the end of our session. Our fourth speaker, our fourth input will come from Dr. Simone van der Berg. She's senior researcher in ethics and responsible innovation at Wageningen University and Research in the Netherlands. She will speak on our way toward trusted farm data sharing practices. Thank you so much with us. The floor is yours. Take it away, please.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Can you see my screen?
Yes, it works well.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Well, I've written this paper, well, it's based on a paper actually, and I've written it together with my colleague, Mark Ryan, so his name is here as well. I wanted to connect to what people were saying before, so, and what I've been reading in the data strategy. There's going to be a data space specifically for farm data, and it's going to be one of the subspaces, if I understand it right, below an overarching common data space. And we need this common data space to foster knowledge and innovation and to strengthen market activities. And so we have certain regulation that will be overarching, and there's also governance frameworks that focus specifically on data spaces, sub-data spaces, such as the one about agriculture. Well, I am an ethicist, so I'm not going to talk about regulation. I'm going to talk about this governance framework. And as Dr. Makar said this afternoon, the development of this governance framework is going to build on our experiences with the Code of Conduct, the Code of Conduct on agricultural data sharing by contractual agreement, which is an example of self-regulation. So I have a few things to say about the Code of Conduct based on our research in Internet of Food of Farm 2020, where I lead a work package on ethics. So that's the background of my lecture here. So just a few words about the Code of Conduct. So Daniel Azevedo has already told you a little bit about this. Well, the purpose is to form contracts between the data originator, which is the person who commissions to create data or to collect them from a farm, or it can also be somebody else. So not a farmer, it can be not a farmer. And so it's a contract between the data originator and a data user. And in this contract, a few things have to be settled. So it has to be clear what terms and definitions are used. The purpose for collecting and sharing and processing data have to be clear. The rights and obligations that parties have related to data, and information has to be provided about how data are stored. And there need to be verification mechanisms for the data originator and transparent mechanisms for adding new or future uses. So there's quite a lot of information in such a contract. And I wanted to focus on the 5 principles that are guiding for the code of conduct. So these have a central position in it and basically form its ethical background. So, so this is about data ownership. And this is ascribed to the data originator. So data ownership means that you have something to decide about something and that you can also profit from it. And the second one says, yeah, it's a principle about data access, control, and portability. And it affirms the right of data originators to decide about who has access to their data and who can use them. There is one clause on data protection and transparency, and that says that any use of data needs to be authorized in a contract, and new uses also. So that would mean that any data user has to actually go back to the data originator to ask for additional consent for additional uses. Well, and of course, there's privacy and security regulation that needs to be respected, and there are IP rights that need to be respected. So these are the 5 principles. And I want to bring forward that it's actually articulating support for a regulation that is already in place, but also supports very much the autonomy of the data originator. And this is the way to support trust in data sharing, to show to the people, the data originators, where data are being collected, that they are standing at the steer and they are controlling what is happening to their data. So there are some serious strengths to this, right? It's a wonderful code of conduct in some ways. So it's a serious attempt to protect these personal interests, rights, and freedoms, and it's shaped by a lot of stakeholders. So very important people in the agricultural sector. So farmers' representatives, representatives of young farmers, large agribusinesses, farm machinery developers. These are important people. So that's something that should not be taken lightly, because it's very difficult to bring forward such a text that is agreed on by everybody. And another strength is that it helps to move towards a practical solution, a contract. And that is also something that people can work with quite easily. But this, here I would like to dive a little bit deeper into what a code can do. What role can a code of conduct actually play? Because we have quite a long history with codes of conduct, which have been developed for professionals, like, for example, engineers or doctors, medical doctors, or also for ICT engineers. And sometimes they have also been developed for particular organizations. And the idea was, the goal was to avoid misconduct, but also to avoid, malpractice and misconduct, and to develop a kind of moral culture. And a moral culture, we mean that you have a certain set of values that everybody takes into account always, right? And that are sort of the self-evident background of how people act, and what other people, how people might expect you to act also. And and it's kept in check by colleagues towards each other. So you might talk to somebody else when this person is malbehaving according to the accepted moral culture. So, so this was the reason to articulate these codes of conduct, or codes of ethics, actually, and these are actually a little bit, they differ a little bit from each other, because codes of conduct usually are a set of don'ts, so they tell you the limitations you have to respect towards your actions, whereas a code of ethics is a set of aspirational principles that you want to strive for and you want to realize that are actually valuable to you. So these have more a positive heuristics. Well, these codes of ethics or codes of conduct are not always effective in practice according to this literature, and there are several reasons why. So there's very often confusion about the content of codes of conduct because they're often not very clearly formulated. They're not always carefully implemented and administered. So there needs to be a manager, for example, or a professional organization that states very firmly that the code of conduct is important to follow. And there need to be trainings that support people to act in accordance with the code of conduct. But the third aspect I want to focus on here, and that is that compliance depends on alignment with values that are recognized and supported by professionals or employees targeted by the code. Well, I think all of these aspects are important in relationship to the code of conduct that has been developed by Copa-Cogeca and the 11 other partners, and they all need attention, actually. But I focus here on the third aspect. So you might ask, is it actually aligned with the values that are recognized and supported by professionals or employees? Huh? So you might ask, in this situation, is there an alignment with other codes of ethics that might be applicable to the same group of professionals? So if you look around, you can see there are different businesses that articulate codes for their employees, such as Microsoft. So they have their values like respect, integrity, and accountability. Or you might look at the code for ICT professionals. And there it says, for example, contribute to society and to human well-being, avoid harm, be honest and trustworthy, be fair and take action not to discriminate, respect the work required to produce new ideas, respect privacy, honor confidentiality. So you see that this code is already richer, actually, than the code of conduct on agricultural data sharing. And you might ask, is there an alignment with the values of stakeholders in the agricultural field? And there, this is a list of values that we came up with on the basis of a series of workshops that we've been doing. So there's autonomy and transparency, and this is well supported by the code of conduct, but also fairness is very important. Fairness with regard to data access, but also with regard to the distribution of benefits that are produced with data. There's attention for care for the commons, and inclusiveness is considered important. So I'm going to explain them in more detail now. So just a little bit about how we came up with these results. So we've done 22 focus groups with 233 farmers, tech companies, and researchers across the European Union. And these focus groups were done in a responsible research and innovation type of way. So that means that we didn't simply ask people for their opinions, but we offered inputs for their reflection, and then saw what happened. So we fostered their reflection individually as well as their conversation together, so that they could help each other also to think further. And we gave different types of inputs. So we gave vignettes about that offer different possibilities for future data sharing. And these vignettes were based on interviews with different stakeholders in the field. Afterwards, we gave them a list of values, and they had to select their priority values, so 3 values, and then talk about their choice. And last but not least, they were offered a few societal issues to think about. And so in this way, they were led through 3 stages of reflection. First, they were asked for an intuitive reaction on the different vignettes. Then they were asked to deepen their personal reflection based on values. And then they were asked to imagine themselves or to take the position of a citizen and then reflect on the same vignettes again or broaden them, right? Because they didn't have to stick to them. So these were the 4 vignettes. The first is the I choose vignette, and that fits very closely with what the code of conduct supports, right? So here is the farmer at the steering wheel, and he or she decides what is to be done with the data. But the second one is the data library, and this connects perhaps a little bit to the idea of data altruism. Sorry. So in this sense, data are stored in libraries, and policy is being developed to govern all the data that are part of that library. The third vignette was the laissez-faire or market vignette. So that means actually you leave everything up to the market, and the do's and don'ts with regard to farm data sharing will come up by themselves. And we have the value chain vignettes, and that means that people that are already collaborating together in the value chain and already do business together will be sharing data together. Well, you see the first 2 vignettes are red, and that's because people very much prefer these 2. So basically everybody supports the I choose vignette, but also to a large part, people were combining it with other vignettes, and the data library was really, really popular. So here you see a few quotes that support autonomy and transparency, for example, and also which comes forwards in the first vignette. So you see, well, I think the farmers are going to want to make the I choose model the default because they just don't trust the system. So that's some young farmers from North Europe that told us that. And you've control, or I've control. You can choose to read the terms and conditions. If you don't agree with them, then you don't. Then you know you don't have to go ahead. So this is very much in support of this idea of forming contracts. But there are also doubts whether contracts always serve autonomy. So some people, so this is just a small selection of quotes, but there are very many. So some people, for example, expressed feeling pushed to make a choice. So they said a lot of times you have to tick yes. You have no choice, for otherwise you cannot use the service. And there were a lot of issues around understanding the information that is provided in a contract or prior to a contract, or difficulties that tech providers brought forward, saying it's very difficult to provide the right information that farmers actually understand and that enables them to consent to data sharing. There's unclarity about who is to decide about what data, also because some people think the contract is about raw data, but some people have the idea that it's also about data after they're being processed or combined with other data and interpreted. So there's a basic misunderstanding there. Farmers sometimes think that they will control everything that's being done by with the data after they have given them. After they have consented to the use of them by tech providers. But tech providers sometimes say, no, they're only consenting to the raw data, but afterwards it's us that is who are in control. Well, fairness, there was a discussion about fair access to data and fair distribution of benefits. So farmers often complain that they don't have access to their own data, and they suspect others will benefit from their data. And they think that there are large companies that walk away with their data and that will be more powerful than they are. So for time's sake, I'll go a bit fast because here I think this is probably interesting as well. So there was also a lot of support for care for the commons, and a lot of comments were put forwards as possible goals to share data for. So people said we want to share data to foster food safety, to enhance public acceptance of food production, to support research and innovation, to show compliance with the law, or to protect the environment. And many people therefore said we should store it, we should store the data in a kind of library. And this is of course the metaphor. It's not an actual library, but the idea was in a library, you have a kind of management of the library, and they can develop a kind of policy that regulates who can have access to the data and for what purposes. And then, of course, there was a lot of discussion about who could be in the management of the library and in charge of developing that policy. So then inclusiveness was really important. This is almost the last slide. A lot of people complained that the data space is very abstract. So farmers sometimes said, where should I go if I want more information? Or who can I call when I have a complaint? And that was one of the reasons why people were choosing the data library as a preferred vignette, because they were saying, then at least I have someone to call when I have a complaint. And so then the data space becomes more tangible and it has a face. So here you see the comparison between the different types of values, the values that we saw stakeholders brought forwards and the values that are supported by the EU Code of Conduct, and you see an obvious discrepancy. So the conclusion is, I think the Code of Conduct is a great start, but it needs enrichment if we want to develop it further into a data governance framework. And and besides that, careful consideration could go into the code and how it's being implemented and administered, because otherwise it sits on a website and people might not use it sufficiently, and it doesn't become part of actually a moral culture. And also the language of the code should probably be clear and concise. And these are the references, and that's it. Thank you very much. Sorry that it was long.
Thank you. Oh, this was very interesting. Thank you, Simone. Really appreciate that. We already also have some questions already for you. The audience seems to be very interested in that topic. We'll get to them in our final Q&A. Before that, we'll continue with our fifth input, certainly not our least input. Our next expert speaker is Professor Leanne Wiseman. She's Professor of Law at Griffith University in Brisbane, Australia. Thank you so much for joining us from really halfway around the world, literally. We're looking forward to hearing your remarks, which will be on the lessons and insights from Down Under. Leanne, you have the digital floor.
Thank you very much.
Yes, wonderful. We can hear and see you. That works well.
Terrific. And I will just share my screen.
Perfect.
All right. Thank you very much. Great. Thank you. It's almost Thursday morning. So good morning, everyone. Thank you. I'm very pleased to be able to speak to you and also to learn from such a learned group about the ambitious plans that you have around a common ag data space. And I'll be filling the chat later with lots of questions. I'm fascinated. Really, I'll just speak briefly about the past 5 years that we have had in Australia dealing with what we would call precision agriculture. I know you talk about smart farming or digital farming here in Australia as well. We have a very simple regulatory structure compared to your European layered approach. we have a couple of key regulators. The main one is our Commonwealth Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment, that basically develops policy around agricultural data. Of late, we have more involvement from our Competition and Consumer Commission and also our Treasury Department, which drafts our laws in Australia. I've also noted we have a Productivity Commission in Australia that's essentially the government's advisory body that is looking at a whole raft of issues that touch upon agricultural data. So I should say at the outset that Australia is nowhere near looking at agricultural data laws specifically at present. We are approaching the regulation of agricultural data through a myriad of different other regulatory devices. And I think it's useful, just by way of comparison, to share our experiences. And they're certainly not necessarily ideal in all cases, if I can say that. This was the starting piece of research where we looked at some of the legal and regulatory issues around agricultural data. It was a first analysis that we had that looked at the legal challenges. When we spoke to the agricultural industries, and we have 15, and you will see them at the bottom of that slide, all of our research and development innovation money in our agricultural industries come through what we would call rural development corporations, and they are a mixture of statutory bodies and private bodies, but they cover every agricultural industry in Australia. Grains is obviously a very large industry for us here in Australia, and a lot of our experiences of challenges with respect to agricultural data come from our broadacre cropping industries, or in other words, in grains. So from this research, we actually did a survey of farmers from across Australian industries, across geographic areas across Australia. As you can imagine, like many other countries, we have quite diverse geographic regions, some very remote farming in the western part of Australia. These are in relation to agricultural data. These are the key concerns. And if you just cast your eye down those percentages, they're all very high in terms of the concerns that farmers had. And these are all farmers, individual farmers, or farmers who are working in a family enterprises. There were no other parties who completed this survey who were involved in the agricultural supply chain or tech providers, for example. So we had the big issue for us was that, and we suspected this, but this was confirmed, that 74% of our farmers who responded to our survey said that they had literally no understanding of what the terms were in their data licenses that regulated anything about their collection of data off their farms. This was very significant. Something that I haven't heard mentioned so far, but it is a very significant issue for our farmers, is that many of our farmers here in Australia do not have their farm data. They don't have access to it. It's often captured by way of a sensor in the ground or a sensor on the tag of livestock, or through their combine harvester or tractor. The data is being collected straight from the machinery or the technology that's embedded in devices, drones, sensors, and it is going straight to a cloud. And the cloud is usually an ag tech provider's cloud. So these are very significant issues about attempts of having farmers share their data. Our farmers don't often have their agronomic data. Some instances they do, and in others, it's their advisors or their agronomists who actually are holding their farm data on their behalf. So we did find that many farmers would like to have their own data, but they cannot get that data out of the machinery or out of the technology that they've signed up to. Half of them said that they were uncomfortable if technology providers had direct access to their data through the services. And this is, as I've just described, this is very much the case with broadacre cropping and the use of GPS-controlled tractors. 67% did not feel comfortable where that data was being on-shared with third parties without permission or without knowledge of the farmers. And this significant issue, as Simone spoke earlier, about the lack of trust that should a technology provider have access to their data, that they wouldn't firstly maintain the privacy of their data, but also that they would not share that with other parties. So these were the major concerns that we looked at in 2015 and 2016. So grouping them together, it's very similar to some of the issues that have been raised earlier about lack of transparency about the terms that they're encountering in data licenses. The second issue around data ownership, we see this terminology used a lot about who owns data, and I'm familiar with the US system where they privacy and security principles where they start with the premise that farmers own their data. It's not very helpful to talk about ownership unless you have physical control and possession of your data. So you may have ownership, and when we're talking about data ownership in Australia, we are talking essentially about copyright law. We don't have any other data ownership laws in Australia. So we're talking about aggregated data attracts copyright protection, but raw data does not. One of the significant issues with respect to the lack of control and access is increasingly the inability that our farmers have to access repair information or diagnostic information about their farming equipment. And this is particularly their digital farming equipment. We have farmers who at harvest time, if they have a breakdown with their tractor, are given an error code on their dash, and they will have no ability to diagnose what that problem is unless they contact the manufacturer. And in terms of timeliness and the imperative of getting a harvest in before a particular storm or weather event, that is not always very helpful to the farmer. So the lack of control and access is also giving rise to concerns around the inability to access repair information or repair services in some remote places as well. And in some places, even the spare parts that you need because of the sophisticated software that's embedded. Again, data privacy and security was a common concern of farmers, particularly because a lot of the manufacturers of agricultural technology are not Australian companies, they're multinationals. And often part of this project was, as a copyright lawyer, we actually read all the data licenses of the tech manufacturers. Most of the time, the data was being stored offshore and in a jurisdiction where that company's headquarters were. And that was often in a jurisdiction well beyond the Australian national borders. So Australian farmers felt vulnerable with respect to using certain tech providers, given where the data was stored, because some of those places were not particularly safe or secure places for data. The inequality of bargaining power and lack of benefit sharing is similar to, as we heard with Simone's presentation earlier. So as I said, the issue about who owns farm or ag data really for us is not the significant issue. The reality is in Australian copyright law, the contract is king, so that you can contract out of all of your intellectual property rights if you comply with the assignment provisions. So essentially, regardless of whether you own your aggregated data that you've been able to collect on farm, or your advisor owns the data that they've collected by way of benchmarking, at the end of the day, it is the technology license or the license that you have with any third party that provides data services that will govern the ownership and the control and access of that data. So looking at those licenses are fundamentally important. And this is where our Competition and Consumer Commission is getting involved. And we also have a suite of unfair contract terms legislation that's in our consumer law that is also being extended to address some of these issues. What we saw in a lot of the data licenses is that there is mention about personal data, private data, agricultural data, but the actual licenses themselves are unclear about the meaning of those terms, and in some cases are just misleading. So even a farmer who had the ability to read and understand those licenses would not have a clear picture about which data was protected under privacy law and which data perhaps became the property of the technology provider and then could be on-shared according to the terms of the license. So that part of the conversation that we had with farmers and industry was an educative one about what is personal data and what is farm or agricultural data. Because as we know, with geolocated data on tractors and farms, while on one level it may be taking agronomic or soil or climatic data, if you can geolocate that down to an individual farm, and there is one family or one farmer who operates that farm, at one level it's arguable at some point that information becomes personal data. And that is, it's not clear in a legal sense, and I haven't seen any scholarly literature about that very point, because I think that's a very significant issue. There is a misunderstanding both within the industries and within regulators as to the difference between farm or agricultural data, machine-generated data, personal data, the language of open data and public data as well. All of those terms need to have some clarification of their meaning. The other two significant issues are about data interoperability, portability, the fact that farmers cannot change suppliers of services. They cannot change from one tractor to another tractor because they cannot extract their data from that one machine to another. They can't take it with them to another service provider. And this is at the heart of it, the inability that they have to access data. So again, these concerns about privacy, safety and security all come from the fact that it's the contracts that are regulating these behaviours. Now, we know that we all have essentially codes of conduct now. Australia has, New Zealand, the EU, the US, all of them are voluntary, and all of them don't provide mandatory or model contracts as an accompaniment. So despite best efforts to ensure that contracts are fair and are transparent, and that they are explained in plain English to farmers, we can't really monitor that while it's a voluntary system. So these issues about farmers not even being able to access their own data is something that's fundamental in almost all of the contracts that we saw, that it wasn't the case that farmers could extract data out of technologies that they had adopted on farm. So in terms of where Australia is with agricultural data governance, well, we're really not much further on apart from identifying rectifying all of those problems. As I said, we're not looking, the government, I should say, is not looking at a specific agricultural data law as such or regulation. But what we have is a raft of data reforms similar to as we've seen across the world since the passing of the GDPR. We've got an opening of government data. We've got public sector data supposedly being opened in a practical sense. That is, it's a different matter. We have the introduction of what we know as a consumer data right, and that is something very similar that has similar traits to the GDPR. Essentially, this is a right that will enable consumers and small business enterprises in Australia to be able to have a right of portability and a right to take their data basically from one service provider to another. This right is being rolled out across industries. It started in banking, it will go to telecommunications, insurance, but it is anticipated that that consumer data right will be extended into our agricultural sector. Our ACCC, the Competition and Consumer Commission, will be looking at that. And we've been talking to them about what unique characteristics agricultural data has and what that will mean for a consumer data right. We're probably 12 months away, 18 months away from that extension. As I mentioned, we have a review of unfair terms legislation in Australia, and this is another example of some of the contracts that we saw would certainly fit within our legislation of being containing unfair terms because of the fact that they are not transparent and the fact that they are inherently imbalanced. There is an inequality of bargaining power between a farmer who clicks to download a software and the manufacturer who has a 38-page contract embedded on their website, for example. The difficulty that most jurisdictions that have unfair terms provisions in their competition or consumer law is that it places the onus on the individual to demonstrate why that particular term or contract is unfair. So should a farmer wish to take on a technology manufacturer, they would have to then commence the action to say, well, this particular part of the contract is unfair. And we know in certain industries we have seen evidence of that. But in terms of someone's ability to take on and sue, start litigation to get a ruling on that, that's unlikely to happen. What is also, so these are the data reforms that we've seen in Australia. This is a consumer data right, just to illustrate where you can find this if you're interested. We did in February 2020 jump on board the data code. Australia, I think, was feeling quite jealous. So our National Farmers Federation, in conjunction with a panel that represented farmers, researchers and ag tech providers, developed a farm data code. I was involved in the development of that, and what was very integral from our research that we have done on looking at the codes is the need to revisit any code that's developed along the lines that Simone talked about. So to revisit, to see that it's actually achieving what it set out to see, how many people were using it, what changes have been made. What's really important is that it's that we see a change in the behaviour in the contractual arrangements. In some of the cases, we haven't had that. So that's coming. The last couple of years in Australia have really highlighted how agricultural data, the information, can benefit not only individual farmers, but communities and the economic viability of nations. We have had 2 years of devastating fire, drought and flood. The government has been focused particularly on the drought efforts with respect to accessing and water. Another inroad is our ACCC is looking at this issue of data ownership and and this again relates to agricultural machinery and the management of agricultural data and the inability that farmers have to repair or access repair information. This is an inquiry that's ongoing at the moment. It's essentially a right to repair inquiry, but it's focusing particularly on agricultural machinery repairs and the fact that agreements between manufacturers and dealers are actually limiting repairs. So it goes back to that very heart of the imbalance in the relationship. We've had work that's been done by the academies on agricultural technologies, highlighting the same issues around trust, issues around interoperability, but also the inability to access repairs. Similarly, there's work being done with the OECD around agricultural data governance, again, focusing on a farmer's perspective about how to rebalance the existing relationship between the technology providers and the farmers with respect to ag data. So our Productivity Commission is also looking at a right to repair, and that will include agricultural data and agricultural machinery. This is ongoing as we speak. And finally, where we are with the Commonwealth Government is essentially the Commonwealth Government is beginning to develop our digital foundations for agricultural strategy. And as I said, these are early days. We're looking at 2021, but unfortunately, as yet, I can't, although it's a digital strategy, there's actually nothing specific on agricultural data in terms of governance. Thank you.
Leanne, thank you so much for your lessons from Australia. We really appreciate that. We'll now be coming to our final Q&A. We'll take the last 15, maybe a couple of minutes time to address questions by the audience. We have actually gotten quite a few. I will be reading out those questions. I would like to bring in Doris Marquardt again to kind of provide some expert context, and maybe a lot of those questions are not directly addressed to one expert or the other. And maybe Doris, you can help me out a little bit to provide the context and pose the questions to the relevant speakers. All of you, of course, can always jump in if you have certain thoughts on a question. And again, I guess my encouragement to all of you, keep your answers short so we can address as many questions as possible. Let's jump right in, Doris. I have a question that I think might be addressed directly to you, but that could also be interesting for other speakers. It says, will the EU aim to drive data interoperability standards at an international level to enable owner-centric data sharing?
Yes, thank you for the question. So first of all, I would like to highlight that the data strategy, in that strategy, such ambitions are not manifested. And that is of total cross-sectoral nature. And it leaves the room for maneuver for the sectors to work on standards or sector-specific standards and frameworks. So at the moment, it's nothing specific plans on international standards, but for sure, if we are discussing a data space and interoperability, is it a high importance for the framing of a data space, and we are thinking about that agri-food chains are global, the question may automatically come up and will be discussed with stakeholders and with member states. So we had already discussions at the webinars I pointed to in the afternoon, and so the question came up, agri-food chains are global. And so far, we have, for instance, Horizon 2020 projects on data interoperability, and those may also provide guidance how it could be achieved. And then the international dimension has to be discussed with the sector. And I'm looking here a little bit at Daniel. Daniel may share his thoughts on that aspect as well.
Yes, of course. The interoperability has been one of the key aspects that we raised since the beginning. It is extremely important that farmers they want to have options to buy a different type of machines, different types of data collection devices, and that they will be able to connect them in order to get the best out of them. So this will give the option to the farmers to choose the best tools that are available. Is extremely important. It should come together, and I think we underlined this at the beginning of the presentation. Data governance or interoperability are just a few of the items that are important for a wide strategy to enable digital farming. And infrastructure is something that is key in order, first of all, to actually access to the different systems so that the farmer can actually bring the data out of his farm and share it to the right people. If there is no proper broadband, for example, it will be really hard. It will not make it impossible, but we all see at our private lives the importance to have broadband around, especially now in the COVID time. And for the farmer, it's extremely important to make sure that the different equipments can talk to each other and that the farmer can get the best the benefit out of it.
And what do you think about the international dimension? So does it play a role whether we focus on European Union standards or international standards? That was the point of the question.
Yes, indeed. Sorry, I don't know if it was directed to me. So obviously, the European agriculture is very much integrated in the world stage. We do import many raw commodities. We do export a lot of added value products, and not only. And we are now engaged in a world stage. Therefore, a lot of the inputs that we take, a lot of the machinery that we take, it comes from outside. It is key that we are able to communicate and to share some of the data with international parts. But from our perspective, EU framework, it will be the key enabler. We are very supportive of EU policy, so we want to see this to be developed.
And maybe if I can briefly jump in here, I would be curious, Leanne, we've heard a little bit the EU perspective on international standards. Maybe you would just briefly want to come in and what do you think, how would Australian farmers or companies think about these international standards?
Well, we have international standards across a whole lot of different areas. I think what we found is that you can have all the standards you like, but unless the contracts that basically will bind the individual farmers comply with those standards, then what then?
Yeah, no, that's a very fair question. Standards need to be enforced, so somehow they need to make sense for sure. This also kind of replies to a next question that is has been addressed to Simone, but that could also be interesting, I guess, to all of you. Maybe Doris, you can also give your thoughts on this. It says, do you expect that the upcoming EU Data Act will make the COC superfluous?
No, I don't think you can create an entire moral culture around data sharing just by means of laws. I mean, yeah, you also need to develop kind of moral routines and a kind of way to check each other whether you're doing things right. So so I think, yeah, probably we continue to need codes of ethics. But maybe part of it can be, can be part of the law. Yeah. So, for example, around this data portability, as Leanne referred to have a basic right around that and to have that supported by laws, I think there will be an aspect that could be covered by law, but other aspects not. For example, around inclusiveness, I can imagine that this would be something to organize within collaborations. So if you have a collaboration along the value chain with different businesses, for example, then probably this would be a good thing to take into account there in your collaboration. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. We have another question that kind of goes in a similar direction. It's almost like a best practice kind of question. It says, how can compliance with the code of ethics be ensured or incentivized? Could be to you, Simone, could also be to the others.
Well, I said a few things about that. So compliance has to do with whether people actually see their own values and norms reflected in the code of ethics. So if it doesn't really reflect that, then probably they feel less incentivized to follow it. But there are also two other aspects, and one is that it should be clearly formulated. And I think that the code of ethics or the code of conduct as it is formulated now, it's quite difficult for a lot of people to understand what exactly they would have to do. And although there's a lot of effort done on being very precise in the language, this doesn't necessarily make it a lot more accessible. And the third thing is that well, if you have a code of conduct for a group of professionals or a single organization, then you always need the management that supports it. You have you need trainings and everything. So we need to think also about how you organize this in a data sharing network. Like, who is going to take charge of saying to the people, look, we stand for this code of conduct and we want you to comply with it. And we're going to help you develop the necessary capacities to recognize the ethical questions when they turn up and behave accordingly. So it seems to me that this should be implemented in the different organizations, like the different tech providers that probably by means of a statement could support it, but that means also additional actions, not only stating that you think it's important, but actually living by it with your own employees and the way you deal with your clients, etc., and training the people to do that. Yeah. But maybe other people have other insights. Sorry if I take up too much.
Yeah, I think it would be very interesting if Daniel could share the view on that as well, because you have the practitioner experience as well around Europe and the feedback probably from your members. So
yes, indeed, and thank you to both. And I agree most of the things with Simona. We had a lot of conversations about this, but the code of conduct, the beginning, it is a political statement, an European political statement that engages several actors, and then it tries to come from the top and tries to bring some clarity. So I think one of the first successes we had was actually to keep the lawyers away. And they tried to come in from every organization, and that was one of the biggest successes, because we wanted to actually create a common language. Even though you might say some of the language is complex, but some of the concepts that we try to address is extremely complex, and most of them we don't even have an answer. So that was the first approach, to make it simpler and actually to find a common language between all the stakeholders. And now we see that actually the proposals that the Commission are coming forward, some of them are very much linked with the principles that we defend in the code, and that is, I think, a success. At least we reach the European Commission or the European institutions, and that was a success. So one of the key aspects it's about implementation, as the question says. It's about enforcement. One of the solutions we have found is, for example, the role of agri-cooperatives, where the farmers, agri-cooperatives are owned by farmers. They're directed by farmers, and there's a democratic way of dealing with issues in a cooperative. And therefore, cooperatives actually enable some of the farmers to track the enforcement of these of the conditions and the contract to enforce the conditions that are set and the principles. We, of course, are moving into a translation of the code because we live in Europe. We have different languages. We need to make sure that this will be accessible. And this has been discussed in a lot of European projects. And as I mentioned in the presentation, a technical solution is very much welcome, a technical solution that will enable the codes of the principles of the code to actually be implemented case by case.
Great, thank you so much to all of you. Klaus Heider, would you like to come in here?
Thank you. Talking not as an expert and not as a practitioner, a person who can give you some experience out of dealing with this code of conduct in the past. But I think it was a great thing, as you explained it, because it gave some answers in its time in 2018. But we are driving more and more also in the agriculture sector into a data-driven economy. And when you ask my personal expectation, I think perhaps there will be a code of ethical conduct also in future, but we need to add to this different elements, additional elements in future. Certification processes, we talked about this portability issue, and I think we have also to look at other sectors and what happens there. I'm still impressed. Yesterday and Monday here in Germany, there was a big national digital summit, and there was one key word or one idea that stayed in my mind. It's talking about data cockpits that every citizen in future will need to own. And in this cockpit, I have this picture of the cockpit in a car or in a plane. You see your data and what rights of data you give to other companies, or you handle in this cockpit with the data rights. And I think that we will have to come in the agriculture sector in such directions as well. Just to give you some ideas that come in my mind right now.
Leanne, I think you're raising your hand.
Thank you. We actually had something very similar here in Australia. It was called a farmer dashboard. And the idea was that there would be a dashboard that the farmer could control where all their data was going, to which companies. It would be a traffic light system between not sharing certain information but sharing others. It stopped at a certain point because of the volume of data that the farmer had control of in the first instance. And that's the difficulty that we had with where the data sits. It doesn't always sit on farm, and it doesn't sit with the individual farmers.
All right, thank you so much. A little bit, I'm having an eye on the clock here, so we're already a few minutes over. I do propose we have more questions, but two of them, they're just brief questions. I just wanted to throw them into the room. I think they would be interesting to all of you. They kind of look more at the operational aspect of the issues we're talking about here. Maybe if some of you want to address them just very briefly, and then we close with that. One question reads, and Leanne, you've kind of addressed this a little bit already, so I think this works quite well. It says, how can we deal with the problem that data provisions are complex and often hard to understand for farmers? And a related question, how can farmers be encouraged to share their data? And it's kind of like a big best practices question again. So maybe if you have some final thoughts connected to those questions or to any other questions, that would be great. And then we would close the session after that.
I could just say quickly, perhaps like in financial agreements or in credit agreements, the providers are obliged to provide a one-page, very simple summary about vital information in simple language for the individuals. We were lawyers and we had difficulty understanding some of the data licenses in some of the new technologies. So I think it's not the case that farmers would be able to do that. The obligation should be placed on the companies that have the resources to provide that information, and it shouldn't be for the farmers to have to hire lawyers to understand that. And if that was the case, I think farmers would be more trusting of companies who are more transparent and who highlighted how their data approach was going forward.
Maybe I could continue here at this point. I think that is one important point, that the bureaucracy is not with the farmers. I think that is important, but the two elements mentioned by Dr. Heider at the beginning, with the labeling of the third parties, which is also an element of the Act on Data Governance, establishing trust through technical solutions could be one option. And looking a little bit further, agriculture data, we said it repeatedly today, has a value. And agriculture data and a common agriculture data space could also serve as a marketplace for data. So if an SME, innovative in agriculture production, for instance, would like to use data from 20,000 farmers, not all the data, but specific data, it could also be a business model. So I think that is one idea we should also keep in mind, that as long as a farmer can decide which data is shared for which purpose, and technical solutions offer the opportunity to decide that, and he is this person or she is the person who decides on that, that could also be an option to really make a business case out of it.
All right. Any final thoughts? I think, Simone, you might have one.
Yeah, I just wanted to remark that actually the vignettes we had about the market model for data sharing was supported the least by our focus group participants. And the reason for that was that on further thought, people said, well, when I sell my data, then they belong to somebody else, and this person can do with them as they please. So I lose my rights over these data. And as for now, I cannot really oversee what this entails. So these type of considerations were brought forward against this idea of a data market.
And then if I just to complete, so one of the solutions that for example, the French farmers found is to create a kind of certification. So if the company fulfills all the requirements and fills in all the principles, then it would get a white stamp where say this, with this company is following the code of conduct you can trust. And then answering the question, how can farmers be convinced or encouraged to share the data? And the answer is always clear. Will they find value on sharing data? Will they benefit from that? So if they provide data to the consumer, will then the consumer also share some of their data in order to ensure that the farmer can integrate it in this process and also have benefits from sharing the data? And that will be always the driver.
And Klaus Heider, you have the last words for the session.
Thank you. But I think this was very intense and close to the core discussion that we just had, and I'm looking forward for the coming discussions in the next track, and hope that when we see each other next year or 2 years from now, we will have this questions brought forward. I don't think we will find solutions in an amount of several months here. It's rather a process that we are starting or where we are staying in now. But I think every participant in this discussion, and I think it's worthwhile discussion that should also be dealt with on a political level. So we do have our agriculture and fishery farm council. So I would like to have our ministers, our political levels also deal with these questions in future.
Great. Thank you so much to all 5 of you. I really appreciate your expertise, your sharing thoughts, you participating in these discussions. Thank you also for everybody who asked questions. I'm sorry I couldn't address them all, but we'll actually take a look at all of them, whether they were posed to our experts or not. With that being said, we'll wrap up the first session of track 2 this afternoon. We'll continue with the second session, a deep dive at 4 p.m. So in a little less than 20 minutes right back here. And so now in very short break and use the networking opportunities if you want to. We'll see you back soon. Thank you so much.